Hey quilters, it's Patti Carey of Patti's Patchwork. Thank you for joining me in the With Glowing Hearts Quilt-Along event celebrating the 10th anniversary of Northcott's O Canada collection. This month, we are working on block 6 of this Quilts of Valor sized quilt. Here's what you need to get started. No new fabrics for block 6. In addition to the pattern, we also need the previously cut pieces of C5, D1, E4, 5, 6, 8, and 9, along with H1, H3, and L2. We start by sewing E9 triangles onto adjacent edges of 4 L2s. I align the top square corner of my E triangle with the L, and I finger press this seam toward fabric L. Now I can add another E triangle onto the adjacent edge, again aligning the top square corners with the square corner of L. This time the seams cross on the 1/4 inch seam line. And I finger press towards L. I make 4 of these. Next I can add an E4 onto each H1. This is a bias edge. My machine likes it best when I start with the tip of the triangles, matching them and sewing to the square end of my seam, gently feeding the fabric into the machine. I finger press my seam away from my background toward fabric H. Now I can add this to my units. I sew from the triangle tip to the square end so that I can better manage the seams in this unit, making sure they don't flip around. And again, I'm going to press toward fabric H. For my next unit, I am making 2 at a time half square triangles, sewing an E8 to an H3. I've drawn a line with a hair marker on my E8, and I'm stitching a scant 1/4 inch on each side of that drawn line. And I've chain piece both of these units. Then I trim my tips and cut along the traced line, finger pressing toward fabric H. For this next unit, I'm aligning my pieces as per the diagram and sewing an E9 onto 4 L2s. Again, aligning the square corner, the top, and my E triangle will extend 3/8 of an inch below the edge. This is a 4-patch unit now, so I can chain piece it together, aligning the 2 pieces in the top row and then sewing the 2 pieces or units in the bottom row, not cutting the chain. I'm going to finger press my seams toward fabric L to allow them to nest, and then I sew the top row to the bottom row. I like to sew from the triangle end of the seam so that I can better manage the seams. I have 2 seams in my top unit versus only 1 in the bottom unit. Once the seam is sewn, I finger press towards the top row and make 4. Now it's time to complete the segment. I'm going to take the unit we just made and sew it to a C5 triangle, aligning the square corners at the top, and my patches will cross on the 1/4 inch seam line at the bottom. Finger press the seam toward fabric C. Next, I add the previous units onto a D triangle. This is a bias edge, so again, I want to start with the triangle tip end, handling it carefully, easing it into my machine, and aligning the bottom square corners at the end of my seam. I will finger press toward fabric D. Now we can sew these 2 parts together to create our segments. Aligning the top square ends, this is a straight of grain seam, and aligning the 2 bottom triangle tips. And I'm going to make 4 of these, finger pressing my seam toward fabric D. These are unusual shaped pieces, but you'll see in a second what happens with this block. We arrange them around our center E6 square. And the next step, we sew the first inch or so of our E6 onto the center part of one of our segments, curving off the edge after 1 inch. And I finger press my seam toward my segment. Placing it back in the rotation, I can now add the adjacent segment. I want to sew from the outer tip or the outer edge, aligning those 2 fabric E triangle tips. The first seam that you come to will nest. So I make those 2 seams align. I can feel if they're nesting or not. And I also align the square ends at the bottom of my seam, keeping everything aligned. I will finger press toward the segment that I have just added, that is away from my E6. Working clockwise around my block, I continue adding the remaining 2 segments, sewing from the outer edge where those triangle tips align and nesting that first seam that I come to, and then finger pressing my seam toward the segment just added. Once all 4 are added, I go ahead and complete that partial seam we started a few moments ago, starting at the outer edge and aligning the first 2 seams, nesting them right there. I sew along the seam line to just past the point where I curved off previously. Once I stitch past that, I curve off again. It's just a small space. Finger press the seam and our beautiful block 6 is done. And here you have block 6. Isn't she a beauty? Now it's your turn. Once you've completed your block, please head over to Northcott's Instagram page and enter the month 6 giveaway for your chance at some fabulous prizes. You'll find all the details on Northcott's Instagram page. If you have not already joined the With Glowing Hearts Quilt-Along newsletter group on my website, pattispatchwork.com, you are welcome to join there too. In it each month, I share extra tips and tricks on how you can get your block done. And there's also a Facebook group, With Glowing Hearts Quilt-Along Facebook group. And the group is quite active. You might enjoy that as well. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you back here next month for the Applique Hearts block.